Hi, my name is Mark Lynn, and I'm the roommate coach. I'll be your host here on KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. My motto is world peace, one roommate at a time. This will be episode 9 of the Roommate Coach. It's going to be part 3 of the Roommate Coach background, in which I describe more about how I became the Roommate Coach. And another important thing is I'm going to continue to explain my values and beliefs. That's part of my background, but more importantly for listeners of the Roommate Coach series, then this is where I will explain more about how I reach my conclusions and the values and principles and concepts I base my thinking on. That should help if you're thinking of trying some of the things I suggest. This helps you understand my reasoning and helps you make a better decision, basically. So that will be episode 9, or this will be episode 9. If you want to leave me any feedback, you can leave it at the website, which is theroommatecoach.com. You can use the contact link on the homepage, or you can call area 707-362-8000, 707-362-8000. Leave a voicemail 24/7. And also, KZZH has been brought to the air by Access Humboldt, which is reachable at accesshumboldt.net. So on to part 3 of my background, or the background of the Roommate Coach, how I became the Roommate Coach. A forerunner to my calling myself the Roommate Coach is a term that I had been called in my younger days when I began to realize I really did want to change things that I thought were wrong. A friend of mine called me a crusader. He didn't say it exactly in a complimentary manner. It was more like tilting at windmills. I kind of took it as a compliment, and in fact I still do, although I think it was more meant to imply that I was somewhat impractical, which might be accurate. The gist of my background and the reason, or how it connects to my Roommate Coach decision, or role, I guess you'd say, is an evolution in which I basically began to realize that conflict was, for the most part, unnecessary. It was obviously destructive, and maybe most importantly of all, I began to see a lot of it as fixable. This is where I began to part company with people such as my friend, who referred to me as a crusader. So there are all kinds of conflicts, and just in passing, how did I decide on roommates? Well, there's an interesting thing about conflicts in general, in that many of them are completely out of our control to do anything about, such as wars and everything, which has plagued humanity for thousands of years, as we all know. There are also quite a few conflicts that really aren't all that important. There are all kinds of little annoying things that happen to most of us pretty much whenever we're out in the world. You know, someone cuts you off in traffic or jumps ahead of you in line at the store or something. So, okay, most of the time we don't make a big deal out of it because they don't really matter in the overall scheme. But what about conflicts that are important and that are within our control to do something about? Well, that's precisely the definition of roommate issues. I think they are important, and as I'm attempting to demonstrate here as the Roommate Coach, I believe something can be done about them. So my story here, my part 3 of my background, is pretty much how I arrived at that position. In part 2 of this mini series about my background, where I left off was talking about influences, people and events that had influenced me, led me to my current beliefs. I was talking about Robert Heinlein, the science fiction author, and one of his quotes that I really liked, happiness is functioning the way a being is organized to function. He is also the one that got me to realize just how important facts are. One of his quotes, which I don't have committed to memory, and I haven't been able to locate it, although I can't say I've moved heaven and earth looking for it, but he talks about getting the facts. He says, avoid wishful thinking, avoid what the stars foretell. I'm paraphrasing now because I don't have it memorized. Basically, he says that facts are your only real clear guide to an unpredictable future. And this is pretty obvious, I guess. It's obvious now, but back then, in my what I guess I'd refer to as my formative years, this was a really exciting concept. So this was another step along the way to my current views. Heinlein had any number of quotes and concepts and beliefs and things that affected me. And again, I can't say that I agree wholeheartedly with everything he had to say, but I certainly took a lot of what he had to say as important and valuable. The backstory, or the wider issue here for me at the time, was this is when I was really trying to understand what it was in our world. Was there something going on? Basically, why was and is there so much conflict, and why do the majority of people seem to just accept it and almost expect it? Well, Heinlein put me on the path to a greater understanding of this. The first quote about happiness and functioning the way we're designed to function got me to realizing that our societies are not designed for maximizing individual well-being. And there's more to it. Another person who influenced me greatly was child psychologist Alice Miller. I believe she was German. She died a few years back. She wrote a lot about difficulties that happen to us early in life. Pretty much, I guess you could say, where our individual spirit tends to meet up against the established propaganda and customs of our various tribes. And for the most part, we have to yield because they're bigger. The others were here first. There are more of them. So all of this taken together helped me to understand not only why conflict is so widespread, but also why, to a great extent, it's just accepted and taken for granted. And perhaps most important to my quest here to deal with roommate issues, I needed to understand why so much of the time people don't want to even look into it very closely and see if something can be done about it. Well, Alice Miller is the one that helped me begin to understand this admittedly difficult and perhaps somewhat controversial aspect of the whole thing, which is that for many of us, it's just too painful. Many of us first experience conflict very early in life when we're not in a position to do anything about it. And the way we are built psychologically is if something is just overwhelmingly painful or humiliating or frustrating, it's a lot easier and perhaps safer psychologically to just block it out and avoid anything in the future that brings it back to consciousness. The result of which is it's more likely that a lot of us will just accept conflict as inevitable rather than attempt to do something about it. You're listening to The Roommate Coach. This is episode 9, which is the Roommate Coach Background Part 3. My name is Mark Lynn. This is KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. The motto here at The Roommate Coach is World Peace, one roommate at a time. Today is the day after Election Day 2016. We've just gone through one of the more divisive presidential elections in recent memory. So to be talking about world peace might seem a little bit unrealistic. But as I keep saying, if you think about your world as your own immediate family, your own immediate housing situation, the people you live with are your roommates, whatever else they may be, and if in that world you're able to increase the harmony and cut down on conflict and increase the peace, then that's somewhat of an increase in world peace in your world. So once again, I will stand by my possibly unrealistic motto. Now, if you'd like to leave any feedback about my motto or anything else about the show for that matter, you can come to theroommatecoach.com and leave feedback using the contact link on the homepage, or you can use the 24-hour voicemail system at area 707-362-8000. 707-362-8000. There's another really important individual that was also very significant in my development. That was Thomas Szasz, S-Z-A-S-Z. I think he died a few years back. He made it into his 90s. He was a very well-known psychiatrist. I guess you'd call him one of the early reform psychiatrists, someone who challenged the paradigm. The psychiatry has been referred to by many as a means of social control as much as anything else. And Thomas Szasz probably did as much as anyone else to advance that notion and to document it, and to my way of thinking anyway, to prove it, to make it very clear. I mentioned earlier that much of my development had to do with my own experience in therapy with Nathaniel Branden, which I enjoyed enormously and I benefited from tremendously. I didn't even realize it at the time, but I was rather fortunate to get into therapy with someone like Branden, who was himself very much a maverick. And Thomas Szasz is one who helped me understand why most people around me had so little interest in pursuing something like therapy, because much of the time it really is, once again, rather than primarily aimed at the benefit and the welfare of the individual, I believe, and Thomas Szasz is one of many who helped me see it this way, that it's more of a social thing. It's basically a way to protect society from those who are going to challenge the existing paradigm, such as the roommate coach. I've actually got a chapter in something I'm working on, in a book I'm working on. I'm calling it Giants. There is a saying I really like. I think it was Isaac Newton or someone like that said, if I can see for miles, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. And I do like to give credit to those who have helped me understand things. Thomas Szasz was definitely one of those. So I guess a quick summary of where this somewhat rambling tale of my background has brought me so far is, early in life, like so many, I experienced quite a bit of conflict with my family. Not just my family, but that was the starting point. And I decided early on to do something about it. I began to realize that conflict had affected me personally, internally, as well as the external world, and to really effectively deal with it and to basically lead a happy and productive life, which is the goal, and I would like to think it's the goal for everybody, although I guess that's somewhat of an open question as well, that you really need to address both the internal and the external. As I spent my time in therapy and related activities that helped me to understand and clarify and at least begin to do something about some of my internal issues. If I'm sounding somewhat conservative in my description, it's because I don't know if those ever go away entirely, but what happens is it's possible to get more control over past influences and things, so you're more in charge of your own life. So I began to turn my attention to the outside world, and what I began to realize were the ongoing effects of all the conflict, the coercion, and not only the effects, but to me, the rather puzzling observation that for the most part, they seem to be just accepted by people around me. Most people didn't seem interested in challenging or trying to do something about them. Now, this last is really important in the present tense to my goal as the roommate coach, to helping people understand how to get along better with people in their lives, especially roommates. My belief that much of the problem we have getting along with each other is pretty much because of how we're raised. It's more or less intentional. We're kind of encouraged to be combative and suspicious of each other. And this is an important concept because what we're told largely is that some people are just difficult and there isn't really much to be done about it. Now, if that were to be true, then it wouldn't make much sense for me to try to do something about it because it wouldn't be possible. Well, I don't think it's true. I don't think that the reason we have trouble getting along with each other is something inherent and inevitable in our nature. I think it's because of the way our societies are structured and the effect that has on us as individuals. And because of that, I think things can be done about it. But like anything else, the starting point is acknowledging what has happened. That's another saying that I like a lot. I first heard it from Nathaniel Branden. Of course, it's been said many times in many ways, which is simply that the truth can never be your enemy. It can scare you, it can anger you, it can be painful in a lot of different ways, but it can't be your enemy because the truth is far and away the most reliable guide to our decisions and our actions. Okay, well, so far I've spoken quite a bit here about people and influences, but as far as my actual background and what have I done, I can get into a little bit of that. As I've mentioned before, I am not any kind of a mental health professional. My beliefs and ideas are completely a result of my own, I guess you'd say, independent experience and independent research for that matter. But I have no academic background, so take everything as information and entertainment purposes only, of course. I do have a degree in marketing, and as a result of that, my early work experience, I spent about 10 years in the corporate world doing various sales and marketing related things, including a stint several years of more or less sales engineering. But the particulars don't really matter all that much for my purposes here. The main thing is I began to realize in the corporate world that once again, it was mostly just conflict, conflict, conflict. And for me, the short story is after about 10 years, I couldn't stand it any longer. And I got out, I took a short sabbatical and wound up getting into computers. Right around the time the IBM PC was introduced was when I made my big career move. I spent probably the next 20 years or so as an independent freelance computer guy, databases and programming and that kind of thing. All through my corporate times and work, I observed pretty much the same thing, as I said, conflict. And something else I noticed, and I noticed this in my IT years, my computer years as well, working with clients, almost everywhere I went, it seemed like the expectations. I remember going into clients' offices and everyone would be running around and stressed out and worried about something or other, and I would inquire, and it turned out that in many cases things were fine. Profits were up and sales were good, but it just seems like the expectation almost everywhere you go in our world is that, oh gosh, something awful is going to happen. And sometimes awful things do happen, but even when awful things aren't happening, that still seems to be the expectation. So I kind of realized that the business world was, to a great extent, just one more example of what I considered just a lot of unnecessary conflict. The relevance, of course, is all of this did was reinforce my desire to eventually figure out how to do something about it. You're listening to The Roommate Coach. I'm Mark Lynn. This is KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. This is episode 9, which is part 3 of The Roommate Coach background. KZZH has been brought to the air by Access Humboldt, accesshumboldt.net. And you can leave feedback for The Roommate Coach at area 707-362-8000, 707-362-8000. It's a 24/7 voicemail line. Or you can go to the web, theroommatecoach.com, and leave feedback using the contact link on the homepage. One way to summarize my life so far as it pertains to my roommate coach endeavors is to say that I've spent I started to say most of my adult life, but probably most of my life, trying to understand conflict and problems between people, such as, but not limited to, problems between roommates. And one principle I've come up with is the realization that even though our societies largely run on the idea of dominate and submit, someone making decisions and others carrying out those decisions, basically controlling or being controlled, the reality is that by nature of what and who we are, we need to function as independent, autonomous beings. So the disconnect between those two is responsible for an awful lot of the trouble we have. Now, as far as why this is important, since obviously no one can change it, I mean, my motto about world peace notwithstanding, I think we all know the fundamentals of the human race are not going to change anytime soon. But there is a much more important aspect to the whole thing. No, I'll correct that. There's two. And at the risk of repeating myself, one thing is, since these problems between people, do have an identifiable cause, that means that it's possible to improve them, if not fix them entirely. The other important thing, really important about understanding the relevance of dominate and submit and coercion and basically trying to control each other, is that if you agree that this is a big part of the problem between people, then that's a real good example of something to do your darndest to avoid doing in your own life, and to do your best to keep others from doing it to you. So it's not just a global macro type thing, it's also a micro thing that can, and I would argue should, pertain in your individual life. And that's an awful lot of my background, and probably the best short summation of conclusions I've come to that pertain to the roommate coach after many years of observing, experimenting, and trying my darndest to understand. So that's a pretty good summation of my background. And now what I'd like to do to finish up this episode is give a brief summary of my values and the principles that I believe that I base my reasoning on for the various things I discuss and suggest as the roommate coach. Many of these come from the people I refer to earlier in the episode and the other background episodes, the people I refer to as giants, as well as my own experiences, some of which is documented in more detail on my website, theroommatecoach.com. But for now, just a quick summary type list. Number one on the list is that coercion is wrong. Somebody told me many years ago that the one evil thing in the world that all other evil flows from is coercion. And I have yet to find an exception to that. I know plenty of people disagree, but that's okay. That's the world we live in. We all have our opinions. But I think coercion is wrong. As I said a minute ago, dominate, submit does not work and can't work long term. For proof of that, I would offer the last several thousand years of recorded history and probably quite a few million years before that. Number two, I would say relationships among equals are the only valid kind. This is an important goal to keep in mind for roommates, is that anything that detracts from the equality, if someone tries to set themselves up as in charge so that the other roommate or roommates are somehow subservient, well then those are not equal relationships anymore, and I don't think they're valid, and I think they're pretty much doomed to either failure or at least ongoing trouble. Number three on my short list here is much of what goes wrong between people has more to do with obsolete responses than anything else. Unfortunately, much of the time, these conflicts become present tense. This is in line with things I've been saying pretty much throughout the various shows, is that our earlier experiences in many cases set us up for trouble. And one of the many problems with the approach to settling differences is that these obsolete problems from the past become present tense problems. It also goes along with my comment, and I think the last show or the one before that much of the time the things that happen between people really are not personal, at least not at first, and unfortunately they become personal. Okay, next on the list is number 4. There is never any justification for intentionally mistreating someone or for allowing yourself to be mistreated. And I would say there are no exceptions to that. And I think that one's pretty much self-explanatory. So I'll leave it at that and go on to number 5. Number 5 is you are 100% responsible for what you do and 0% responsible for what others do. The only person whose behavior you have the ability or the right to change is your own. Now, one of many useful offshoots specific to the roommate issue is my comment, which is really a paraphrase of something I heard years ago from Nathaniel Brandon, the therapist, where I say, in order to have the right roommate, you need to be the right roommate. And the beauty of that approach is the only behavior you need to do anything about is your own. And for number 6, I'll just finish the list with a phrase or a saying that is so widely spread that it's a cliche, and maybe some of the time we don't even stop to think about it. But I think it's probably the best short prescription for getting along that I've ever heard, and that's live and let live. It's simple and it works. Okay, so that's my list, and this has been episode 9, the part 3 of the Roommate Coach background. And of course, you've been listening to the Roommate Coach on KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. The bumper music is called Rollin' at 5, and that's by Kevin MacLeod. The motto at the Roommate Coach is World Peace, one roommate at a time. Now, it's probably going to take a while to get to the larger 7 billion plus world. So I don't think I'd hold my breath on that one. But for your own individual world, just you and your roommates, if you manage to increase the harmony and decrease whatever conflicts you might have, then that's world peace in your world. KZZH has been put on the air here in Eureka and Humboldt County by Access Humboldt, accesshumboldt.net. And you can leave feedback for me, for the Roommate Coach, at theroommatecoach.com using the contact link on the home page, or you can call 707-362-8000, 707-362-8000, and leave a voicemail anytime, 24/7. So that's it for episode number 9, and I look forward to talking to you again real soon. Thanks so much for listening.